All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Deb. I'm a real alcoholic. Hey, I have been sober since March 15th, 1987. I know, it's a long time. It's a really long time. Trust me, I was not planning on being here this long. I wasn't. I was one of those people where I came into Alcoholics Anonymous and I was sure that everybody had made a mistake, that all the adults in my life were overreacting, and that clearly I was not a real alcoholic and I didn't have to stay sober for the rest of my life, right? Because when I got here, I heard you guys, like you were like, oh, it's just one day at a time, and I was like, that's not what you really mean. You really mean I can never drink again. And for those of you who are like, 70 years old, you don't have that much time left. So not drinking for the rest of your... Just kidding. But when I was 15 years old when I walked into Alcoholics Anonymous, right? And so people who were 40 were old. But I was like, no, if you're 70, like the rest of your life isn't that long. It doesn't sound like a bad idea, right? But, the rest of my life for me, like that could be 80 more years of not drinking, right? And do you have a sufficient substitute? I don't know about that. Anyway, so my task this morning is to talk about we agnostics. I will admit to you that this is a different format. I've been a little intimidated by it. I've read we agnostics 3 times a day, every day for the last week. Waiting for some form of additional inspiration, because clearly what I've been doing for 37 years isn't enough. Anyway, so instead of competing against the other speakers, I'm just going to join in with them, and we're gonna do the best we can to get through this. One of the reasons why April asked me to do this in our chit chat, she said, because when you speak of God and you speak of your relationship with God, it's impactful. And I have had a deep and effective spiritual experience. I continue to have a deep and effective spiritual experience that has all of these little baby awakenings throughout it. And I have absolutely been stalked by a God that I did not know existed and did not believe in my entire life. And it wasn't until I landed in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous that you guys taught me to lift my head and look around and realize that he had been there the entire time. And I was astounded by that. See, I was born and raised in this little tiny town outside of Akron, Ohio, and it's a little hillbilly town. Like, I say that because it's a little hillbilly town. The majority of residents in that little town, they came out of the hills of West Virginia when the coal mines started closing down, and they were all members of random unions and all of that stuff. And they, there's a culture that comes with that. And there's also this, lots of little belief systems, right? We talk a lot in Alcoholics Anonymous about we have to overcome old ideas, right? And so I got all these old ideas that I brought into Alcoholics Anonymous, and many of those old ideas were really rooted in self-reliance, right? If you want it done right, you do it yourself, right? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? If somebody knocks you down, first time, shame on them, right? But if I come back and you still haven't gotten up, shame on you. I mean, just all of these old ideas are really, really rooted in reliance on self. And if I'm not living the life I want to live, it's my fault. Now, it is deeply influenced by the man who has been keeping us down generationally, right? So let's not forget to blame the man. But at the same time, I am responsible. I am responsible for making things happen. I'm responsible for fixing things. I'm responsible for all of it. And so when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous and said, yeah, you're responsible, but you have left this entire body of power completely untapped, I was like, I don't understand. I don't understand what you're talking about, right? And they said, well, self-reliance has failed you over and over and over. And I'm like, well, that's true. That's absolutely true. Anyway, so when I'm sponsoring someone, by the time we hit we agnostics, now we hit we agnostics pretty quickly, right? Because I don't believe in taking a really long time to do the first trip through the steps. I come from some training where we go through the steps really fast because we got to knock the edge off, right? Just enough to allow me to come all the way in and sit all the way down. And then we're going to redo the steps at 3 years when your skin doesn't fit anymore. right? And you've been making bad decisions based on the same faulty thinking. We're going to go back through and we're going to redo the steps, right? And at 11 years, when you can't hear me anymore, I'm going to turn you over to someone else that I know, and they're going to work a set of steps with you. And we're going to encourage, right, to have a new experience with the steps over and over and over, because they are layers to these things, just like there are layers to my relationship with God, right? The concept of God that I had when I walked into Alcoholics Anonymous was really none, or so I thought. I wasn't raised in church. I wasn't taught how to pray. I didn't know the words to the Lord's Prayer when I got here. I was a little bit of a blank slate. I knew that there were powers in this world that were greater than I was, because I grew up in active alcoholism. And my dad, in his anger, very powerful, ran everything, absolutely ran everything. So I knew that there were things that were more powerful than me, but the idea that there was something that was more powerful than me that had my best interest at heart, that I could actually tap into, that if I were willing, that power would actually take over and do for me what I couldn't do for myself. And the first thing that it could do for me, if properly employed, is it could stand between me and a drink. Because that's where it all starts. If I drink, all bets are off. Now, today I can tell you, my life is not about avoiding a drink. I have been placed in a position of neutrality by that incredible power. But when I was new, I needed something to stand in the gap, something to stand between me and that first drink. And I didn't have anything like that in my life. And so the old folks that were getting me sober, they dumped me into the realm of the Spirit very quickly. So I landed in this little country experience of Alcoholics Anonymous, but right outside of Akron, so heavily influenced by the First 100 and all of that kind of stuff. I didn't know any of that at the time. But I was dumped into this little country experience of Alcoholics Anonymous, where it seemed like everyone in AA there, they were ancient. And they had been sober since Christ was a child. And the president of Alcoholics Anonymous at the time, his name was Mac Shadburn. And Mac ran Alcoholics Anonymous. He was the guy that had the chair right back at the entry and exit door. And all of his guys were the greeting gauntlet that you had to walk through if you had the audacity to go to a meeting on time, which wasn't an issue for me for a while. And his nemesis was a woman named Jane. And Jane was as old as Mac, and she'd been sober as long as Mac. And Jane, they would carry Jane into every meeting in these wooden high-back chairs, because they would, right? So she would have her assigned parking place at every meeting, and they would have these, and they would go get her out of the car, put her in this chair, and 4 newcomers would like carry her down the stairs into the church basement. And they would place her like as close to the podium as possible, and then people would line up to talk to her, because she was that old timer who had that amazing quality of taking a genuine interest in the lives of others. I mean, she was just kind, and she listened a little. Unless you started talking foolishness, then she'd shut you down pretty quick. But she followed your life, and she was interested in it. She wanted to know how the job interview went. Right? If you had gotten the call to go back to your daughter's house for Sunday dinner and you hadn't been invited back there for 16 years, she would make you a side dish and a little crock pot thing so that you didn't show up empty-handed. Right? She was that kind of old timer. And Mac is in the back ruling, with a whip. And the two of them they were the opposite ends of the old timer spectrum. And thank God we had them both at the same time, in the same room, with the kind of dedication to Alcoholics Anonymous that they had. And the other thing is that Mac was raised in organized religion. Mac came into Alcoholics Anonymous, as he would tell it back then, with a very clearly defined idea of who and what God was. But even though he had a clearly defined idea of who and what God was, he had no active relationship with that God. None. And so the work that he had to do in Alcoholics Anonymous is that he had to take a look at that clearly defined idea and determine if that was something that he wanted to embrace, if that was something that he wanted to engage in. And Mac decided to go ahead and go all in, largely because he was married to a woman he would refer lovingly to as Mother Superior. And she had done without him for some years while he was out there running the streets. And the least he could do was go to church with her now. And so he did that. But he introduced me to this idea that it was really okay to revisit the religion or the ideas that you were raised with and see if they fit. And if they don't fit, then try something new, but give them an opportunity to fit. Because we are quick to see where religious people are right. And Jane's experience with God, however, was far less defined. It took me a long time in Alcoholics Anonymous to realize that my first sponsor, who ended up being Jane, that my very first sponsor was the closest thing to an atheist I had ever met. When I went up to, I'd been sober for, like 6 weeks, so I knew a lot. And I went and I sat with Jane and I was like, okay, we got to talk about this God thing. Everybody's talking about God. I don't know what God is. I don't know who God is. What is God? And she said, God is good, orderly direction. You've been needing some of that and I'll be providing it. And she did. And for some reason, it was one of the first miracles in my journey in Alcoholics Anonymous is that I listened to her most of the time, which is just fascinating. I hadn't listened to anybody for a long time, right? I was obstinate and defiant, and if it looked like it was going to do something decent in my life, I ignored it completely. And anyway, so I come in and there's this old woman who's, barking orders at me, but being loving to everyone else. And I was like, oh my God. But she never could actually verbalize her concept of God. She didn't have spiritual language, but she clearly had a connection to something. She had a connection to the idea that Alcoholics Anonymous was the process that would deliver us into the realm of the spirit the way we needed to get there. And she really didn't have an opinion about anyone else's spiritual journey. She really didn't. She didn't care. As long as you had physical sobriety and you started acting right, that's really what she cared about. And she was my sponsor for a year and a half. And she was only my sponsor for only a year and a half because so when I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, they were looking around and they said, look, who is going to sponsor, right? Because I was very disruptive. And so they sent me out drinking. Because they asked me those two questions that are at the beginning of We Agnostics, right? They wanted to know whether or not I actually believed I had alcoholism. And so Mac asked me those two questions. He caught me when I was sneaking out of another meeting early after being insanely disruptive the entire time I was in the room. And he stopped me when I was leaving the room and he said, "Are you alcoholic? Are you? Are you really alcoholic?" And I just looked at him and went, and he said, "Can you control your drinking? When you begin to drink, can you stop abruptly? Can you do that?" And I went, because I had never tried. I was like, no, I'm going to take the cap off the bottle. I'm going to drink it all the way. And then if I can walk, I'm going to go find some more. I mean, that's just, right? I mean, that's just kind of how that goes. I'm usually face down in a mud puddle, but some days were better than others. But he asked me those two questions when I was sneaking out of that meeting, and it's on page 44. It says, if when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you're probably alcoholic. And there were many mornings, because I was face down in a mud puddle many nights, when I would come to in the morning and I would say, man, I just don't want to do that anymore. I don't want to drink like that again today. I just don't want to do that. Right? I want to have a little something to drink, but I don't want to drink that much. I want to have a little something to drink, but I don't want to cross the tracks. I want to have a little something to drink, but I don't want to be face down in a mud puddle. I want to have a little something to drink, but I don't want to go there with them and have that stuff happen. I don't want the life that I'm living because of my constant drunkenness. And then my head would engage and it would say, you don't have to. It'll be different this time. You don't have to. Just keep the cap. Because that's going to make all the difference in the world, right? Just keep the cap. You'll be fine. But the idea of having just a little something and stopping, like I'm a kid, I'm drinking in cornfields, right? What am I going to do with the leftovers? I mean, I got a logistics problem, right? So I'm just going to drink it all. And so this idea of drinking just enough, well, what was enough? What was enough? I'm walking around and I am on high alert because everything in my life, because of the decisions I'm making and the places I'm going and the things that I'm choosing to do, everything in my life is a threat. And I am walking around on high alert. And so what's enough? How many drinks does it take to get my shoulders off my ears? How many drinks does it take for me to loose my little fists? How many drinks does it take for me to exhale all the way? I don't know the answer to that because I go from none to oblivion and I don't stop in between. And so can I control my drinking? How am I supposed to know? I'm a kid drinking in cornfields. Anyway, so Mac took $5 out of his back pocket. He gave it to me and he said, "Here's $5. Go try." Go try. Go try to control your drinking. And if it doesn't work, you get back here. And if it does, I never want to see you again. And I was like, sweet, right? Somebody with some authority finally understands what I really need. And off I went. And I went out and I drank one more time. And I was going to have 3 shots and 2 beers because that was very moderate. I mean, I was drinking a fifth of vodka a day, so 3 shots and 2 beers, that's moderate. My scale might have been a little off. Anyway, and the next day I climb out of my final blackout and I walked back into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. And instead of getting there late and being just an absolute disruption, I got there on time. I sat in the middle. I got my coffee before the meeting started and I didn't get refills because I used to get refills. In the middle of the pitch, walking in front of the speaker. Dragging my chair, because, they were metal and folding and they make a lot of noise when you drag them, which just made me happy. But I got there on time. I sat in the middle. I had 1 cup of coffee. I didn't get a refill. I bummed all of my cigarettes before the meeting started. I stayed seated the entire time, and an hour is a long time when you're brand new. It's a long time. It's another reason why it's okay for newcomers to sit in the back, as long as there's a few old-timers who are peppered in there. Anyway, and I entered into Alcoholics Anonymous having a new understanding of the fact that I actually have alcoholism. Now, my understanding about who and what alcoholism is and how it affects me and all that kind of stuff, that has to develop over time. And certainly in walking through the first portions of the Big Book, I am so incredibly grateful that the old people who are getting me sober, they allowed us to linger in the doctor's opinion so that I could understand that my alcoholism was not defined by my consequences of drunkenness, that my alcoholism is defined by my thinking and the fact that my head talks me into taking a drink against clearly my own best interest, and that I have a body that is 100% allergic to alcohol, and when I swallow it, the phenomena of craving is triggered in me, and the more I drink, the thirstier I get, and that's that. That is alcoholism. The more I drink, the thirstier I get, and it does not matter what mood I'm in, what day of the week it is, how much money I have, whether my bills are paid, unpaid, who likes me, who doesn't like me, whether I'm fat, whether I'm skinny. Nothing. When I swallow alcohol, the more I drink, the thirstier I get. That's alcoholism. That is the thing that we all have in common. And I needed to understand that, especially walking in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous at 15 years old, because it was really important. It's really important for all of us to know whether or not we have alcoholism, because we have to concede that fact to our innermost selves. I have to believe that that is true, just like I believe that it is true that my eyes are hazel in color. I am also alcoholic. I have hazel eyes, I am 5'9", and I am terribly allergic to alcohol. Therefore, I can never safely take another drink, as long as I know that everything else is available to me. And by the time we hit We Agnostics, Bill had spent a long time in writing, describing to us what alcoholism is, what alcoholism isn't, telling us stories of other people who had alcoholism so that maybe we could begin to have the beauty of identification, so that maybe we could come all the way in and sit all the way down and give this thing a shot. And then we hit We Agnostics, and all of a sudden it's not so concrete. We hit We Agnostics, and all of a sudden we're not just talking about my drinking and the trouble that I'm in and the pile of problems that are astonishingly difficult to address, right? We're not talking about that stuff anymore. We're talking about this thing that is insanely abstract. And so when this chapter is written, thank God, they weave a lot of examples and a lot of statements that harken back to the concrete, right? That remind me that I am considering the God idea because I had been convinced in the first part of the book that self-reliance had failed me, and that where alcoholism is concerned, I need a new employer, I need a new director, and I need a brand new relationship with the Father. A brand new relationship with the Father. Because if I held out in having a relationship with my spiritual father because I judged who and what the spiritual father would be based on my earthly father, I was in trouble. Because my dad was the drunk and he was mean. And if I continued to define the word father by my earthly experience, I was never going to be able to get there. Because even though I wasn't raised in religion, I was raised in a place where people went to church. Even if they didn't act like they belonged in church, they still went on Sundays. It was very weird, right? But they went, and they identified. You know, it was one of the questions in elementary school, right? Which church do you go to? Which religion are you? And I just remember the first time I remember being asked that. I was in 3rd grade, and I looked at them, and I said, I don't go anywhere. I don't have one of those. Am I supposed to have one of those? And they're like, yes, you're supposed to have one of those. And I was like, well, how do I get one? And no one could answer my question. But immediately, I was outside of the realm of the Spirit because everybody else had some kind of entry hall pass that I didn't have. And I didn't know that I was supposed to belong to something. And then we would pray in school, and I didn't know any of the words to any of the prayers. And I was an outcast again. And so when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous and I saw God, 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 I was like, oh, here we go again. Oh, here we go again. Anyway, so thank God for We Agnostics, and thank God that there were old-timers in my area who were getting me sober, who had every kind of experience when it came to the approach to the realm of the Spirit. And so they could share those things with me. Anyway, so I've got some notes because, you know, I've read this thing 3 times a day for the last couple of weeks. I got notes. Established up to We Agnostics, right? We know what's wrong with us. We know that we have a mental obsession and a phenomena craving. That has been made very, very clear masterfully in the doctor's opinion and the first 3 chapters. We know that we've had years of broken promises and relationships that need mended. We have revisited that. We know that reliance on self over and over, in light of failing over and over, is not working, which is what makes us strangely insane where alcohol is concerned. We have been told, and it's been demonstrated in our pages, that our thinking takes us back to the application of self and fixing problems and figuring things out and managing our lives, even though we were just dismal failures in doing it by ourselves. But we've revisited that, and so now we are convinced that maybe our thinking might be a little bit faulty. Possibly. Maybe. And that the manifestation of self in our thinking delivers us back into the delusion that this time it'll be different. That I can get comfortable without you. That I can live a life that makes sense without doing all of this AA nonsense. That I don't really need you. Thanks a lot for the few months of sobriety, but I got this. Thanks a lot for the coffee. Wasn't very good, but that's okay. We need something other than self to recover. That has been made very, very clear to us all the way through those first 3 chapters. We need something other than self to recover. But now what? We've also been told that that something that we need better be pretty powerful, because I am standing convinced that my alcoholism is pretty powerful. And I am standing now convinced, most of the way, that I cannot fix my own alcoholism. And so if I'm to get well, I have to get plugged into a source of power that is bigger than me, that is bigger than you. I have to get plugged into that source of power, and I am open to that by the time I get to We Agnostics. I'm still just a little worried about what that's going to look like. And so the question is, how do I not only discover who and what the power is, but how in the world do I get connected to it? How in the world do I leave self on the sideline and choose to put God in instead? How do I see self as a bench warmer and God as the starter? It's completely new thinking for me. Completely new thinking for me. So Bill, in his ultimate sales pitch, which I think is what We Agnostics is, right? Bill was a salesman, and I really do. The more I read this chapter, the more I believe that this is the ultimate sales pitch, right? Bill is like, look, we know that a relationship with God, that some kind of experience in the realm of the Spirit is absolutely essential for long-term sobriety, and we have to get people into it. And especially in the 20s and 30s, right, which was informing our experience that went into this book, especially then, our nation, we were church-going people, right? Even if we weren't acting right after church, we were church-going people. We really were. And we had this kind of free-floating Christianity that was in all of the nooks and crannies across our nation. All of it. And so Bill essentially said, look, I think that most of us are agnostic. Right? Most of us believe that there is something, but we are not connected to it. Most of us believe there is something, but we can't touch it. We can't have a relationship with it. We're not engaged with it. Most of us believe that there's something, but we have no active relationship. And so We Agnostics is really, it's this sales call that is set out to take on all of our objections to God. And listen to some of these, right? So if you dismissed God because you fancy yourself a person of science, we got you. If you dismissed God because the experience of your childhood wasn't great, we got you. If you dismissed God because you think that religion and religious people have been unreliable, we got you. If you dismissed God because you think that the God of your religion and the way you used to believe and trust obviously wasn't good enough, we got you. If you dismiss God because the idea of having faith just seems like too much work, and you're not one who has faith in things, we got you. If you dismiss the idea of God because the idea that you would worship anything leaves a bad taste in your mouth, we got you. And if you dismiss the idea of God because you just can't do it the way others do it, we got you. It's all addressed in We Agnostics. And so when I'm using this chapter in sponsorship, it's really important that I know the sponsee that I'm working with, that I know where she comes from, that I know what kind of training that she had, that I know the experiences that she brings to the work. Because if she's not overly scientific, why am I going to take her into the anti-science of it all, right? If she's not raised in religion, why would I introduce her to religious bias? But if she was raised in religion, I need to know what worked and what didn't work. What was your experience? What are the old ideas that you've brought into this? If the only concept of a power greater than you that you have is your alcoholic, drunken, abusive, angry father, okay. You're also going to work a 4-step and get over that, but we got you, right? So I need to know who I'm working with so that I know how to take them into the literature. And that's key, right? And sometimes I won't even read all of We Agnostics with someone. I'll just take them to the spot that really addresses the thing that's wrong with them, because sometimes it can be pretty heady stuff. And especially when I'm working with really young people, talking about, prosaic girders, I'm not going to survive that. Just not going to survive that well. I also love that in We Agnostics, Bill uses one of those old sales techniques over and over and over, and it is the feel, felt, found sales technique, right? It is where you just look at someone and you say, I understand how you feel. I felt the same way. But what I have found after employing this approach is this. And Bill does that over and over and over in the chapter We Agnostics. I'm going to read a little bit. To one who feels he is atheist or agnostic, such an experience seems impossible, but to continue as he is means disaster, especially if he is an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. To be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face. It just makes me smile, right? Now that I am no longer doomed to an alcoholic death, I look at that and I'm like, it's kind of a no-brainer, right? But when I was weighing my options, it seemed like a viable thing to consider. Here's the feel, felt, found. But it isn't so difficult. About half our original fellowship were of exactly that type. At first, so we understand how you feel. At first, some of us tried to avoid the issue, hoping against hope they were not true alcoholics. But after a while, we had to face the fact that we must find a spiritual basis of life or else. We understand how you feel. We have felt the same way, but what we have found is, perhaps it is going to be that way with you. Give it a shot. But cheer up. Something like half of us thought we were atheists or agnostics. Our experience shows that you need not be disconcerted. In other words, we don't care. We don't care. Whatever label you choose, that's just a starting point. If a mere code of morals or a better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism, many of us would have recovered a long time ago. We found that a mere code of morals and a better philosophy of life were not sufficient to overcome alcoholism. We gave that a shot. Even our founders were participating in the Oxford group approach before they sobered up. And they had a mere code of morals and a better philosophy, and it wasn't working. But we found that such codes and philosophies did not save us, no matter how much we tried. We could wish to be moral, we could wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might, but the needed power wasn't there. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly, so self is not enough. And this was Dr. Bob's experience. This was absolutely Dr. Bob's experience. Annie was a devout Christian. Annie was 100% in alignment with the Oxford group process. She really held out a lot of hope there. Dr. Bob would go to Oxford group meetings before he sobered up just to try to keep what little peace he could muster in the house. But Dr. Bob understood that it didn't matter, it didn't work, that there was something missing. He absolutely knew that. Lack of power, that was our dilemma. We had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously. But where and how are we to find that power? And then it says, well, that's exactly what this book is about. Well, that's exactly what this book is about. You need to be connected to a power greater than yourself. Who's that power? How do you get connected to it? How do you get into relationship with it? And they go, don't worry about that. We got you. We got you. We got a whole book about it. I have a whole book about it. And then at the bottom of the page, it says, well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem. And in the first edition, it says, which will enable you, which will solve your problems, plural. And by the time we got to the second edition, it was singular. That means we have written a book which we believe to be spiritual as well as moral, and it means, of course, that we are going to talk about God, which should come with some theme music. Dun, 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 right? Here, difficulty arises, which to which I say, no shit. Many times we talk to a new man and watch his hope rise as we discuss his alcoholic problems and explain our fellowship, but his face falls when we speak of spiritual matters, especially when we mention God. For we have reopened a subject which our man thought he had neatly evaded or entirely ignored. And remember, too, that when this book was written back in the 1930s, that prohibition had been in full swing. We had lived through some of that. We had been asked to sign temperance pledges. We had asked to, treat alcohol as if the substance itself was evil. I mean, living in this society as it existed back then, we had been put through the paces by people who came out of a very structured experience of who and what God was. And so by the time we are beat up enough and we are having an initial experience with Alcoholics Anonymous, we've also had many experiences with all of that. And so some of the way this is written is really to address some of those things that we've had to live through. I mean, Bill talks about it in his story, right? The proffered temperance pledge that his grandfather wouldn't sign because, he didn't want to believe that way. Right? And so Bill was introduced to the idea, right, that the realm of the spirit is broad, roomy, and all-inclusive, right? His grandfather took him out into the woods and said, this is where God is for me. The very first woman in Alcoholics Anonymous, her name was Ethel Macy. We don't talk about her a lot because we talk about Marty Mann instead. She was a New Yorker. She lived longer, she wrote stuff. And maybe she founded the National Council on Alcoholism, so she was a little bit of a rock star, right? But the very first woman in Alcoholics Anonymous, write her name down, from the Akron area. Her name was Ethel Macy. And Ethel was one of those, when she showed up at Dr. Bob's house for the very first time, they told her to go sit in the kitchen with Annie. And she said, why would I sit in there with her? And they said, well, because that's where the women sit. And she turned and she looked at that room of men and she said, I have alcoholism too. Is she treating alcoholism in the kitchen? Well, she didn't use those words because we didn't have those words yet, but that's essentially what she said, right? And Dr. Bob was like, oh, I don't know what to do with girls. What am I going to do with girls? Right? We don't know how to do women in Alcoholics Anonymous. Oh, my God, he just, yeah. Anyway. And Ethel said, I'm not sitting in the kitchen. I'm sitting in here with all of you. And I'm not going to church. I'm going to my garden. I don't find God in church. I find God in the dirt. And so Ethel gave us permission to stay out of church and to go to wherever it is we experience God most. And so she was an outdoors woman, and she was formidable. And a really cool story, just a little quick aside. So, probably 7 or 8 years ago, some of my girlfriends, we all came to Akron, and we were staying in my house, and we were going and doing all the, history tours and all that kind of stuff. And one of my girlfriends is from Lower Mississippi, and she's a powerhouse, right? She's been sober over 20 years, and her first 6 or 7 years, she was super sober, right? And doing all of the general service stuff and all of that, and she was whatever, right? Area service, and then she had kids, and and her whole life changed, and things changed. Now she's not super sober, but she's still sober. Anyway, and she's, with us this weekend, and we're touring around, and we're walking through the archives in their intergroup office in Akron, Ohio. And if you have not been, get in the car. So we're walking through all of these incredible archives in Akron, in the intergroup office, and we have this wall with as many pictures of the first 100 as we could find, and little stories about who they are. And we're walking down and we're looking at this wall, and she stops and she looks at Ethel Macy, and she said, where were they from? And I said, well, they lived in this area, but their family was from Indiana. And she said, okay. Who was her husband? And so we did a little, and so we figured that out. And I said, why are you asking? And she said, now, she is at this time, she's sober, but she's not going to very many meetings. She's very much on the fringe. And I'm worried about her because I've watched it over and over and over. When you stand up and you leave the middle and you move to the fringe, you will often end up drinking. So she's on the fringe. And she said, my maiden name is Macy. And my people came out of Indiana. And so she starts doing some digging, and she realizes that Ethel Macy is her great-great-aunt, and that she is actually related to the very first female member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I was like, well, why don't you come back to the middle and sit all the way down so that you can carry on her legacy, please? Right? We never know how this stuff is going to come about. Anyway, love me some Ethel. So we're constantly reminded that self is not enough. Bill is constantly using the feel, felt, found method to have us consider some spiritual concepts that he is providing to us. On page 46, it says, yes, we of agnostic temperament have had these thoughts too. So I'm going to back up, sorry. At the bottom of 45, it says, we know how he feels. We have shared his honest doubt and prejudice. Some of us have been violently anti-religious. To others, the word God brought up a particular idea of God with which someone had tried to impress them during childhood, right? So now we're taking on those two particular challenges. Perhaps we rejected this particular conception because it seemed inadequate. With that rejection, we imagined we had abandoned the God idea entirely. We were bothered with the thought that faith and dependence upon a power beyond ourselves was somewhat weak, even cowardly. We looked upon this world of warring individuals. So this is an entire paragraph where it summarizes all of the objections that we have about God. And it says, we of agnostic temperament have had these thoughts and experience. Let us make haste to reassure you. We found that as soon as we were able to lay aside prejudice and express even a willingness to believe in a power greater than ourselves, we commenced to get results, even though it was impossible for any of us to fully define or comprehend that power which is God. So very early on in this chapter, it says, yes, self is not enough. You have to have a relationship with God. We know that you have objections about having a relationship with God, and we don't care. And we don't care what you call God, because it's impossible for any of us to fully comprehend who and what God is also. Even those of us who've been sober for 2 years at the time the book was written, right? And so we give the newcomer the wiggle room to be wrong. We give the newcomer the wiggle room to not be sure. We give the newcomer the wiggle room to be certain, but to need to fix the relationship that they have with this God that they believe in. You know, I often think about my relationship with God. So I've moved a lot in my life. I have lived in 9 different states. I've moved 13 times. I'm not running from the law. I've moved around largely because of work projects and things like that. But I've literally lived coast to coast, north to south. I have a full experience. You know, Alcoholics Anonymous is alive and well in many places. There are a couple of places I would encourage you to not go. But I don't talk to them out loud when I'm being recorded. I'm just kidding, but you have some opinions. Anyway, so as I've moved around the country, I buy and sell houses because I need a place to live, or I move into apartments or whatever, but I move a lot. And so there's this constant process of, looking for a house and assessing a house and trying to figure out if it's got good bones and see if, and the house always needs updated or renovated or whatever, but if it has good bones, then maybe it's worth it, and is the neighborhood right and all of that. And the other day I was just sitting and I was thinking, I was like, it really is kind of like building a relationship with God, right? So it says, we need to enter the realm of the Spirit on our own terms. We need to take a look around, see that things are a bit outdated, but also see that it's got good bones and worth doing a few updates, especially the kitchen, where we create life-giving and life-saving food. So we make an offer by saying a prayer, modeling the behavior of those other AAs who've been successful. When the offer is accepted, we do some inspections, documenting what needs to be fixed, updated, completely renovated. Sorry, lost my place. Then I get to move in, and I get to work making the space mine. to share with who I wish. And I like the feeling of the soft textures I've chosen, of the colors I've chosen. I've incorporated all. I build a space in my new house where I feel comfortable, where it's warm, where it's inviting. I open my doors. I have a housewarming party. My friends come in and visit me there. They bring me small gifts that I can incorporate into my home. And it adds a little something. And my house grows in its warmth and grows in its appeal. And I reach a point where I don't lock my front door anymore because I want people to come and visit me often. I want you to come and sit in my space and have an experience in my space. But when you walk in the door, you're going to bring with you who you are. When you walk in my door, you're going to bring your old ideas, and you're going to bring your desires, and you're going to bring your need to have a relationship with God. But my house is fully renovated, and it's updated. And there's food in the kitchen, and there's a comfortable couch, and there's a spot to sit and look out at the lake. And you can come in, and you can be at home in my house. And when you come into my house, when you come into my spiritual house, and you hang out with me, and you realize that there's no lectures to be endured, there's no specific prayers that you have to say. You don't even have to wipe your feet on the mat if you won't do it. You can just come in and you can share what I have. And if what I have births a desire in you to have a little something more, then I'll take you house hunting. And we'll go to a neighborhood that you think you like. And we'll look at all of the available properties. And I'll help you look at the bones to see if the bones are good and whether or not I think the renovation is going to be worth it. And you can tell me what you like and what you don't like. And then I'll help you figure out how to make an offer. And I'll help you learn how to build a relationship. And you'll get your house. And you'll renovate your house. And you'll paint the walls. And you'll put your textures in. And you'll build that really good kitchen so that when people come over, you can feed them. And then you'll have an open house. And we'll all come over. And we'll bring little things, little thoughts, little ideas, little practices, little prayers. And we'll bring them to your open house and we'll offer them to you. And you'll take what you want and you'll leave the rest. And your home will now have a little bit of us in it. And those people who couldn't take my bright colors and all of my bold textures will find comfort in your home because you used earth tones. But my house and your house is now part of the same community. And then someone's going to come to your open house, and they're going to form a desire to have a home of their own. But they don't want to live where we're living. They don't want to live on the lake or in the suburbs. They want to go deep into the city. I don't know anything about the city. But I know somebody who knows something about the city, and so I'm going to introduce you to them. And I'm going to walk alongside you to make sure that you find the right place in the city. And I'm still going to help you through the process of buying the place and assessing the bones and figuring out if it's worth it. And when you buy your place in the city, you're going to put your own colors in it, and you're going to renovate it, and you're going to make it everything that you want it to be. And then you're going to open your door, and you're going to have an open house. And we're going to come visit. And we're going to bring you little things. We're going to bring you little prayers and little hopes and little dreams. We're going to bring you little pieces of stuff. We're going to ask you what your colors are so that what we bring to you might be appropriate. And we're going to help you to develop your space where you feel safe and protected. And when you do, you'll unlock your front door. And people will come and sit with you. And people will experience your space. And you will introduce them to a feeling of peace and serenity. And now our community, it's got a place in the city. And a place in the suburb. And my place on the lake. And all of our doors are open. So that no matter who comes knocking, no matter who's looking for us, If you're a city kid, we got a place for you to go. If you're a suburban kid, we got a place for you to go. If you love the water, come on over. And the community just grows. And for me, that's very similar to what we do when we're building this experience in the realm of the Spirit. When I use the word God, I have a specific concept of God in my mind. To me, there's a physical manifestation of God that happens in my mind's eye. There's a feeling that I have when I say the word God. There's an experience that I have had of God over all of these years. There's a particular concept that I have. But when I say the word God, my friend Dean from New Jersey, who's sitting in the back, I promised I would mention him during my talk. He has a different idea of God. He sees God differently than I do. His experience of God has been different than my experience of God. And there are people who will come and sit with me, and they will find that comfort and they will find that growth in my experience. But there are people that need to go sit with Dean because they will find their comfort and their growth in his experience. And the beautiful thing is that in Alcoholics Anonymous, we have all of the experiences to offer. So I'm going to tell you just a couple of quick stories and then I'll finish. So where I got sober was outside of Akron, Ohio, so it was in the country. And there was a meeting that I used to go to on Thursday nights. It was in Fredericksburg, Ohio, which is in the heart of Amish country. And the very first Amishman to ever be sober, his name was Mose Yoder. Sounds like an Amishman. Mose Yoder got sober. He died in 1984. I didn't get sober till 87, so I didn't know Mose. But I knew the second longest, right? I knew the guy that he had sponsored the longest, and his name was Danny Shetler. And Danny Shetler is still around. Danny Shetler is super old. Danny Shetler was super old when I got sober. But Danny Shetler was still around, and Fredericksburg was his home group, and so that's the group where most of the Amish went. And on the last Thursday of the month was Pie Night. Now, that may not sound like a big deal until you think about homemade Amish pie, right? And so we would all establish a relationship in Fredericksburg because we never wanted to miss Pie Night. And so we would go and so every Thursday night they would drive me, and it was 40 minutes for me to get out to the Fredericksburg meeting, and we go to that. And I loved old timers. I just absolutely loved old timers. I didn't trust anybody else, but if you were old and had white hair, you were my people. And so I would sit really close to Danny all the time because I felt like if he was like the grand poobah or the president of the Amish AA, then I wanted to be near him. And so I would spend all this time with him. And there was this man who used to come out of the big city of Akron. His name was Jeremiah. And Jeremiah would come and he would sit with us. He would sit with Danny, and he had a rock for a higher power. A rock in his pocket. And I was sitting there one night, and Jeremiah shows up, and he has his seat, and he puts his rock on the table, and Danny says, "Why are you bringing gravel into my meeting?" And he said, "That's my higher power." And Danny looked at him, and he said, "That's ridiculous." And he said, "No," he said, "this rock can go 24 hours without taking a drink. I've had a tough time doing that. And so this is my higher power. It's got more power than I do." And Danny was like, "Well, that's just stupid." He didn't care much about, the whole, no lectures to be endured, no judgments to be had. Anyway, and so he and Jeremiah started having this conversation about who and what God was. And this conversation went on for weeks. Every Thursday, it was like Thursday night at the fights. I just loved it because Jeremiah is now defending his rock, right? I mean, if Danny hadn't come out swinging, he may not have felt the need to defend it, right? But he came out, so he's defending his rock. And Danny is talking to him about there will come a day when God needs to be bigger than that. There will come a day when God needs to get in all of the nooks and crannies. There will come a day when that rock will not be enough. And I listened to the two of them talk about who and what God was. And what they demonstrated to me in that ongoing conflict and discussion was that the highway, the realm of the Spirit, really is broad, roomy, and all-inclusive. Never forbidding, never exclusive. Because Jeremiah had a rock for a higher power, and he had physical sobriety. Danny had been restored to a central place in his Amish community with the culture and with the religion that goes with that. And so highly structured, lots of do's and don'ts, to absolutely no structure, rock in the pocket. And both of those guys were able to have physical sobriety. But what Danny was explaining to him is that the relationship with God, indeed, we enter into the relationship with God so that God will stand between us and a drink. But when God stands between us and a drink and we have physical sobriety, that's where everything else starts. That's not the race, that's the starting block. It's the starting block. And so why does our concept of God have to continue to grow and change? Why do we have to continue to have this expanding relationship and experience with God? It's because life is coming. And being human sometimes is hard. And being human is also oftentimes joyful. And when we're having an experience with life from a seat in the realm of the Spirit, we have a shot at not only living through it, but thriving through it and helping others through it and rejoicing in it and possibly never being scared of it. Because if I don't have a relationship with God, I don't have any way to live without fear. If I don't have a relationship with God, how can you possibly expect me to sit in the vulnerable stillness when I need to be delivered from where I am to where God wants me to go? If I don't have a relationship with God, I will not follow you. I can't. I must have a relationship with God. And my relationship with God, just as my concept of God, needs to be able to grow and to expand. And so Danny and Jeremiah are having this fight for like 6 or 8 weeks. I mean, these guys are going at it. And so I would go to the meeting earlier and earlier because I didn't want to miss anything. And I asked Danny one night, I said, why are you continuing to argue with Jeremiah? I said, he's not going to give up that rock. And he said, God doesn't change his mind first, he changes his heart first. And I believe that God will change his heart, he will lay down that rock, and his concept of God will be different. And I said, I don't think that's true. He is really set in his ways. And he said, I think it is true. He said, you just wait. And so I went to that meeting over and over and over, and I waited. And one night, Jeremiah walks into the meeting. He looks at Danny and he goes, and the two of them walked into the kitchen. And thank God it's one of those church kitchens where the top half of the wall opens, right? So they're standing in the kitchen, and I went up and I went, and the two of them are in the back of the kitchen, and they're having a really hushed conversation. And then they just kind of looked at each other, and they leaned in, and they did one of those man hugs where they slap each other on the back really hard. And they came out of the kitchen, and Jeremiah sat down, or Danny sat down, and Jeremiah walked by, put his rock down by Danny's coffee cup. And Danny just looked at me and went, oh, the realm of the Spirit really is broad, roomy, and all-inclusive. I came here with no concept of God, knowing that there were things more powerful than me, but no concept of God. And through the process of Alcoholics Anonymous, through taking the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, and through sitting in donut shops, listening to all of you tell your ridiculous stories, I came to believe in a power greater than myself, and that power would stand in the gap, and that power could ensure physical sobriety so that I could live a life that I didn't know was available to me. And that's what I have today. Thanks, guys.